part 4 of the consciousness map, and today we're looking at the highest level of visual innervation, the ecstatic seizure states. Right here we have a meditative breakthrough, or the kundalini, or enlightenment. There's a lot of different terms across a lot of different practices, experiences, and traditions that we could use to label this here, but for now we're just going to stick with these to get the general idea. It's important to note that seizures are abnormal electrical activity in the brain. Whether that activity is hypersynchronous, or there's just too much intense firings, or there's just an overload of electrical activity, those are all seizures. Seizures can pass by unnoticed. Not all of them are the grand mal or the clonic-tonic seizures, which involve the convulsions and muscle contraction. The purpose of labeling this both as the ecstatic state and the seizure state is to acknowledge the positive and negatives, or the potential dangers, as well as the lore or the subjective experience of this state being ecstatic, being a sort of divine or incredible experience, while noting the dangers and the potential long-term effects. What kind of seizure it is depends on the intensity of the electrical activity and where it's occurring in the brain. For these mystic states, this is seizure activity with parasympathetic activation. Essentially, what we're looking at is parasympathetic activity that is synchronous or overclocking the parasympathetic nervous system. One of the staples of the parasympathetic nervous system is that it increases cerebral spinal fluid secretion and cerebral blood flow. Cerebral spinal fluid surrounds the brain and spinal cord, and it provides nourishment, it removes waste, and it acts as a shock absorber. For kundalini, which is this latent energy that is awakened at the base of the spine and sent up into the brain, part of the physiology of the kundalini is cerebral spinal fluid through parasympathetic activation, as well as other techniques meditators use in order to circulate cerebral spinal fluid and to increase its production in the brain. To do this puts you into a seizure. Too much pressure in the brain and you run into something like encephalitis, which is brain swelling and inflammation in the brain. But we can talk about that specifically in another video. For now, just think of it as seizure is increasing electrical activity for parasympathetic activation. Through training, through disease, or maybe accident or some kind of circumstance, the innervation is overloading the parasympathetic nervous system. And keep in mind that our understanding of seizures is by no means comprehensive. And it was only recently that there was a link between hypnotized states, so trances, through sleep activation, and going beyond that, breaking through beyond that into seizure states associated with mystic experiences with things like enlightenment, the kundalini rising, and breakthroughs. But we can get into that more in a future video. For now, we're going to go to the trauma survival sympathetic activation of the ecstatic seizures. And here we have possession. The sympathetic nervous system innervates nearly every tissue in the body. Now imagine what happens when that innervation is either synchronized or it's being overloaded, it's being completely overclocked, the sympathetic nervous system being heightened beyond its normal abilities at the cost of actual nerves. Instead of just using all the energy in a nerve, imagine that you're exploding, you're killing nerves in order to draw out more energy for a short period of time. So we have demonic possession, cases of people doing feats of strength and acrobatics that defy normal human capability. In warfare, you have this idea of being possessed by a god of war during battle. This state, and all of these states at the top level here, is the source of this trope in movies and TV where the character is able to tap into something destructive in order to gain more power or abilities temporarily. And it's usually at the cost of their sanity or their life force itself. And that's exactly what's happening. You've glitched the body and brain in order to draw out more energy, to kill cells in order to use that power for different purposes. Again, whether it's intentional or whether it's just a slow buildup of psychosis and hallucination and night terrors and just worse and worse trauma survival situations. So this term here is kind of naming it off of the lore around that state from history and different perspectives in ancient cultures and whatnot. Next to possession, in the less extreme, just the fight situation, we have animal fury. If I can spell. This is the sort of unleashing the beast, the Ulfhednar of the Vikings, the wolfish rage of the Greeks, the amok of the Malaysian, which is the tiger spirit, or the shorn ones of the Aztec warriors, as well as even lycanthropy and the werewolf lore and other animal-human forms of like bloodlust and rage, the kind of bestial fury. All of these are pretty defined as losing your sense of self because the brain is being glitched, it's being overloaded or hypersynchronized. So you have this idea of kind of dissolving the ego, dissolving your sense of self and melting with the world or the universe. Or in the sympathetic activation, you've lost your sense of self and now are possessed or taken over by something else. And to clarify, we're talking of the physiology of these states and not necessarily personal or spiritual or religious implications. These are events of the body that take place during these kinds of experiences. And again, don't hold on to these labels because in part 5, we're going to explore how you make your own version of these catered to yourself. But for now, we still have this last point to fill out here, which is the king or the prophet state. Now, the reason I'm using king or prophet is because in ancient times, this was the ideal state for kings and for prophets, which I won't spend too much time talking about that because I have several videos exploring that, how they trained or they wanted these kings or prophet may have learned how to get into this special ecstatic state in order to receive divine information or to become like a living god, which in the case of the shaman kings or the deified kings, that was a requirement for being a king, was being able to get into a state at this level. Just kind of like the flow state, except instead of being balanced and rejuvenating, it's overloading the flow state. It's a flow state that will burn you out. So at the cost of having a heightened flow state, an overloaded or overclocked flow state, you're going to burn yourself out. The innervation is sending so much extra energy that you're destroying cells in order to tap into more energy. So as an overview, we can trace, we can define and map out the levels of autonomic balance and visual innervation. So this is a sample version of how I understand it through the things that are relevant to what I research. So I'll do part 5 immediately after this, and I think that will be the most useful and the most practical for yourself. This is meant to serve as just explaining it on a conceptual level. We could talk about any point of these so much further, but for now, this is just meant to be an overview. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you at part 5.